Kia ora, good evening everyone. Hey, and May, thank you for putting me last because I got to hear some really inspiring perspectives on diversity, so I've really enjoyed that. I wanted to just start with where we started as a bank on our diversity journey, and that was back in 1915 when we employed Ivy Walters as our first female employee. So I think we've come a long way there, and some would say that banking is still a very male, Anglo-Saxon dominated industry, so we've got more work to do, and why we have to keep tackling diversity in all its forms, and particularly for us, why we tackled gender diversity first, because it was a very obvious issue for us in the industry. Now today, of course, is International Women's Day, and I only had one. I've been very impressed with a lot of the diagrams, but I do want to put up one slide because it's relevant for today. So that's my mum in the photo, and I don't know who that young man is. That's my mother, and I think we talk about leaders being authentic, and I guess what shaped our core. And you know, my mother has certainly shaped my core. She was a single mum, brought us up, and I saw the struggles that she went through when she had to deal with the sort of hidden barriers that women often face in work-life balance. And also, she was a social worker, and she spent most of her life helping migrants try and navigate their way through invisible, often very visible barriers, cultural barriers that they faced when they arrived in Australia, which was my place of birth. So I think at BNZ, on the gender diversity front, we've done well. We've obviously received some awards. We won an award from the UN 2 years ago and from APEC, and that's on the work we've done in gender diversity. But I think, and for those that are interested in the lessons there, we did publish a white paper two or 3 years ago. Lana West, our Head of Diversity and Inclusion, who's in the room, if you want a copy of it, it is available, I think, on our website, and we're going to download it onto the New Zealand Asian Leaders website. But if you want a copy or to talk about it, Lana's here. She might say afterwards because it's getting late, but Lana's the right person to talk to. But on a super diverse future, I think I thought quite a bit about this in the lead up, and of course, as a number of the speakers have reflected, we're not looking at a super diverse future, we're looking at a super diverse today. And I think that whole notion of super diversity, particularly in Auckland, has snuck up on a lot of us. And so one of the things I think is about needing to move more quickly and adapt more quickly, because I think the forces at play that we're all seeing in Auckland and in New Zealand in particular is something we need to tackle more quickly. So I have 5 lessons that I just want to briefly touch on, and these are lessons that we certainly haven't perfected, but lessons that I think we've learned through the work we've done on super diversity. So the first one is, lesson 1, it makes good business sense. I get really frustrated when I hear people talk about this in terms of political correctness in the context of tackling diversity, because to me it just makes good commercial sense, and that's important to us as a bank with shareholders that want returns. So the more diverse, of course, your workforce, the more diverse the thinking and the ideas, the more innovation and creativity, the better decisions you make, and ultimately the more talented employees that you attract from the market, and ultimately the better returns to your shareholders. So for us, it's not about political correctness, it's about making sure that we're making the most of diversity to enable a higher achieving New Zealand and to achieve as a bank. For BNZ to be successful, we need to remain relevant to what is a rapidly changing customer and employee base. And I think understanding what the diverse needs are of those employees. And I think it's been really important that a number of speakers today have called out that diversity is not just about what you look like or the country you come from, it's about, you know, who's influenced your life, your background, and certainly respecting individual difference is really at the core of diversity. And that's why we talk about diversity and inclusiveness, because we think that's a really important part. It's not just important to have a workforce or customer base that looks different, but you have to have a culture that's inclusive, values that individual difference, and can leverage that diversity. And I think Carol spoke quite a bit about that. I think if we can connect with our diverse customers, they'll stay with us for longer. They'll tell their friends and associates about us, and we'll attract more of them. And certainly from, you know, a global war for talent, and I thought Mitchell's presentation was fascinating, and what a great model. You can see the way that the labour force is changing, and how the battle for talent is just changing so rapidly, and so you're going to have to adapt and think very differently about how you attract diverse talent inside of your organisations. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is, I sort of call it "This Time It's Different." So I grew up in Australia. We saw quite significant migrant flows more recently from Vietnam, but post the war from Europe particularly, but they were incremental changes to our population there, and I think if you were part of the original Indigenous peoples of New Zealand, you probably experienced more of that dramatic impact of migration and diversity, and we're starting to see a more dramatic impact of that in New Zealand. And I don't need to quote any of the stats that you heard today from people about the dramatic diversity in New Zealand, and one that really sort of made me stand up and take notice was the one that Derek mentioned, where, and this wasn't about migrants today, this was about the number of ethnicities or cultural backgrounds of just his existing domestic students, which was 190 different ethnicities. So we're already in that super diversity phase. So I think it's like nothing we've ever experienced before. I really do think it's having a dramatic and very big impact on our country. So we need to understand the needs of that changing customer and employee base, which links me to lesson 3, which is understand the status quo, and a number of the speakers spoke about that too. This is the bit that you have to invest in as an organisation, finding out the nitty-gritty and who your customers are and who your people are. Now, we started with our people because we wanted to get a really good baseline of who we had inside the organisation. And we did a staff census, and we found that we do have a very strong Asian population in our team. More than a third of BNZers were born overseas, and of those, most were from Asia. Almost 1 in 5 identify as Asian versus 11% of the population, so 20% versus 11%. But, you know, we face some of the same issues that was raised earlier in the public service by Lewis around when you start to go up the levels around leadership, you see those representations drop down. So we've got a lot of work to do on, I think, pulling people up, showing them pathways for development and career progression. The Superdiversity Centre has audited our cultural capability, and the audit tells us that there are some things to celebrate inside of BNZ. I think we manage our people really well. We have a strong culture, and I think it's been mentioned by a number of the speakers that culture isn't just about ethnicity. We have a very strong, collaborative, inclusive culture that's very customer focused, and so I think we have a good base to start with. Our staff are comfortable when working with different cultures, and where they think they have a weakness, our staff are willing to learn and want to learn. So I think we've got half the battle. There are things though that we need to improve from that audit. We need to work harder for Indigenous languages and culture inside of the organisation. We need to align our cultural knowledge in the business context, especially with expressions of non-verbal behaviours. When we know about our people and most immediate needs, we can prioritise things that will make the biggest difference there. And that said, the lesson 4 is there's no such thing as a perfect plan. And this is probably the shortest lesson. Don't obsess about writing the perfect document. And I think a couple of speakers have talked about this today. Yes, you have to have a strategy and a focus, but more and more I'm learning as a leader in a company, you've got to be agile. You've got to test and learn, you've got to iterate, you've got to adjust, and you've got to adapt. And one of the most inspiring presentations I've seen in the last 12 months was when May came in to present to a lot of our staff on the findings of the Superdiversity study. And you started with a poem, which was the first time in the bank anyone started with a poem. And May reminded us about the importance of taking the first step, which I think reinforces this point. And it wasn't about how perfect the first step was, it was just about taking the first step, because then if you take the first step, it'll likely lead to your second, and then it'll lead to your third, and you probably don't know what the third step's going to be, but you know if you take the first step, you're well on the way to getting to the third. So I thought it's really important that you don't obsess about the perfection of the policies or processes. You start somewhere and you involve your employees and your customers in designing what those solutions should look like. So that's lesson 4. And then finally, lesson 5, don't delegate this to HR. Now, one of the people I respect the most in the world is Annie Brown, who's our Director of People and Culture. But I cannot stress this enough, because it's not just an HR policy, it must be part of your business strategy, and you have to connect it to commercial success. So if you're a CEO in the room, you have to lead that change. You have to make it personal and you have to get involved so that you're credible with your people and you're truly engaged in the issues. Now, if you're not a CEO in the room and your CEO isn't engaged, I think you have two choices. The first choice is to find one that is, or adjust how you are influencing your CEO and your executive team. Shake it up, challenge them, be brave, and I think, you know, we heard the comments a few times about how, and Julie mentioned it, that you've got to have a perspective that everyone's a leader, and if you're truly a leader in your organisation, you can learn from everyone inside of your organisation. And I can think of two people, just to give two examples, who've challenged me to address superdiversity within the company in the last couple of years. The first is Pierre Tohe, who's not here today, but he's our head of Maori business development. And Pierre really challenged my knowledge of Maori culture and took our executive team and our board to spend a day on a marae, and at Auckland University actually. And there we learnt about Maori culture, about protocols, about challenges and issues facing iwi. And that was really, and that day was essentially in us establishing our Maori business development strategy. And as a banker and as a commercial guy, I thought, well, that's a smart strategy because there's a huge part of the economy that is controlled or owned by iwi, and it's becoming greater and greater, so we want to be part of that. But the biggest impact, which I hadn't expected, was the amount of feedback I got from the 11% of our employees who are Maori to say, look, I was just so proud of you even establishing that strategy. It's the first time I felt like I belonged inside of the bank. So I think don't underestimate the impact you have on your own employees when you focus on an external market of the community. And the second was May, who challenged all of us with the findings of the Superdiversity Stocktake and the work of the Centre to tackle superdiversity, because I think you need people that are going to poke you and prod you, challenge your thinking. So I'm accountable for BNZ's progress in managing superdiversity and how to leverage that for competitive advantage for us and for New Zealand. So on my exec team, two or three of whom are here tonight. Thanks for staying, guys. And I think one of them leads our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and one of them leads our LGBTI Council. And half of our execs I was very proud of marched in the Pride Parade last month. We've just appointed Lana as our Head of Diversity and Inclusion inside of the organisation, and I think Lana will play a really important role in helping steer the strategy and helping point us to the gaps and the things that we're not seeing. But it's not just Lana's, to my original point about HR, it's not Lana's accountability to deliver it all, it's mine and the executive team and indeed everyone inside of the company. So I think that navigating superdiversity will continue to challenge our business, and May mentioned that earlier, but I know that the rewards will be great. I know that it will mean that we are better connected to a very rapidly changing customer base and a global war for talent, and us wanting to attract the most talented people from the most diverse backgrounds. So I'm very confident, very optimistic, very glass half full about the opportunities that this presents. And I think Julia's point about us being a city that already displays a lot of success from a bicultural perspective, I think we can take a lot of those learnings and skills and apply them to this question of superdiversity. So thank you.